Welcome to the Restricted Handling Daily Intel Brief. Let's dig in. Here's what's been going on in Russia in the last 24 hours. Today, the big story is that the war in Ukraine is increasingly becoming a battle over economic endurance, strategic depth, and the ability to make the other side feel the cost of continuing the fight. The front line remains important, but the bigger contest right now is happening hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles behind it. Ukraine is trying to make Russia's size work against it, while Moscow is scrambling to protect the infrastructure that keeps its war machine moving. One of the clearest examples is playing out in the Black Sea. Russia and Ukraine are no longer just fighting over military targets. They are fighting over commercial shipping, grain exports, energy infrastructure, and the economic networks that connect this conflict to the rest of the world. Russia announced this week that it is increasing protection for commercial vessels in the Azov Black Sea Basin and creating new plans to reroute cargo if necessary. Moscow says it is responding to Ukrainian attacks on shipping, while Russia itself continues striking Ukrainian ports and maritime infrastructure. The result is a dangerous cycle where two major agricultural exporters are putting pressure on a trade route that matters far beyond Europe. This is the kind of issue that starts as a military problem but quickly becomes a global economic problem. Russia is the world's largest wheat exporter. Ukraine is also a major agricultural supplier. If shipping disruptions continue, the consequences could show up in food prices and supply chains, particularly in parts of Africa and the Middle East that rely heavily on Black Sea grain. Europe is also stepping up pressure on another piece of the Russian economy, the shadow fleet that helps Moscow move oil around sanctions. An Italian-led European Union naval mission boarded a sanctioned tanker called the Toa Payo in the Mediterranean on Sunday. The ship had recently switched to a Cameroon registry, raising questions about whether Russia-linked vessels are using new flags and paperwork to avoid restrictions. The boarding itself is important because it shows the sanctions fight is becoming more physical. For years, the shadow fleet has been one of the ways Russia has adapted to Western pressure. The Kremlin has essentially played a giant game of maritime shell games, moving ships, changing registrations, and finding new ways to keep energy revenue flowing. Europe is now trying to make that game a lot harder. Inside Russia, another major story is the growing vulnerability around senior officials. On Saturday, a bomb exploded outside the Balzy restaurant in central Moscow, killing at least 3 people and injuring more than 20 others. Russian authorities called it a terrorist attack, but have not identified who was responsible. What makes this especially notable is that Russian military-linked sources suggested the possible target may have been Colonel General Alexander Chayko, the commander of Russia's aerospace forces. That has not been confirmed, but the possibility alone is significant. Chayko is not a minor figure. He previously commanded Russian forces in Syria, played a role during the failed 2022 push toward Kyiv, and took over Russia's aerospace forces this year, amid criticism of Russian air operations. If senior Russian officials are increasingly vulnerable inside Moscow, that creates a very different security challenge for the Kremlin. Russia has spent years projecting an image of control and state power, but attacks on figures connected to the war effort, whether carried out by Ukraine or domestic actors, create a very uncomfortable question for Russian leadership. How secure is the system, actually? That concern comes as Russia is already dealing with manpower problems. Reporting indicates that Russian military recruiters are becoming increasingly aggressive in trying to fill the ranks. In some smaller cities, recruiters have reportedly detained men during document checks or pressured them into signing military contracts. This is a familiar pattern in Russian history. Moscow has often relied on the machinery of the state to absorb enormous costs, whether during the Soviet era or today. But coercive recruitment is also a sign of pressure. When a government has to work harder and harder to convince citizens to fight, it tells you something about the gap between official messaging and public reality. Ukraine, meanwhile, is betting heavily on the idea that Russia's geography can become a weakness. Kyiv has continued a campaign of long-range strikes against Russian infrastructure, including oil facilities, logistics hubs, and military-related sites deep inside Russian territory. The strategic goal is straightforward: force Russia to spend resources defending everything, everywhere. Ukraine wants Moscow worried about refineries, warehouses, airfields, ports, and energy networks far from the battlefield. One of the most interesting parts of this campaign is the evolution of Ukrainian drone warfare. Units such as the 414th Separate Unmanned Strike Aviation Brigade, known as Magyar's Birds, have developed a system that combines commercial technology, open-source intelligence, and rapid battlefield adaptation. Ukraine has effectively turned drones into a strategic weapon that allows it to strike above its weight class. That does not mean every strike succeeds. Russian defenses still intercept many systems. But the larger issue is the pressure created by the threat. Every refinery, radar site, and logistics hub that Russia has to protect requires resources that cannot be focused elsewhere. Russia is responding with its own technological adaptation. Moscow is fielding newer drone variants and longer-range strike systems designed to hit Ukrainian infrastructure while keeping aircraft farther from Ukrainian defenses. The competition increasingly looks like a technological chess match, with both sides constantly adjusting. The air defense fight remains one of the most important pieces. Ukraine has shown it can intercept many Russian attacks, but Kyiv continues warning that interceptor shortages, especially for Patriot systems, are becoming a limiting factor. Russian propaganda has tried to portray newer missiles as unstoppable, but the reality is more complicated. The technology race continues, and ammunition availability may matter just as much as engineering. Finally, there is a political battle happening alongside the military one. Ukraine secured a major European commitment for joint production of drones and long-range missiles, including a €10 billion package tied to broader EU support. But Kyiv is facing criticism over domestic reforms, especially judicial independence and anti-corruption efforts. That creates a difficult balancing act for Ukraine's allies. They want to support a country fighting a major war against Russia, but they also want Kyiv to continue building the institutions required for long-term European integration. The war is increasingly being fought on multiple fronts at once: the battlefield, the economy, shipping lanes, information space, domestic politics, and industrial capacity. The next phase may be determined less by who captures the next kilometer of territory and more by who can sustain pressure longer while maintaining political support at home and abroad. Thanks for listening. Go enjoy the rest of your day before the geopolitical situation gets worse again. For the full written brief, it's restrictedhandling.substack.com. We'll see you in the next one.